The fog had not lifted from the coast that morning, and the small village of Haversfield seemed suspended in it, quiet, colorless, almost frozen. The sea could be heard but not seen, a low pulse beneath the silence. Near the end of the main street stood an old municipal building with boarded windows and a rusted sign that still read, Public Library. Few remembered when it last opened. Most avoided it altogether. Elias Turner arrived in Haversfield on a Wednesday. He had come seeking distance, from the city, from people, and from the memories that trailed him like restless ghosts. He rented a small cottage by the cliffs and spent his first days walking through the town's empty lanes. That was when he noticed the library's door slightly ajar, though the lock was meant to have rusted decades ago. The hinges whispered as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp paper and iron. Shelves leaned at odd angles as if they had softened over time. Dust floated in slow motion, catching beams of light that seemed delayed in reaching the floor. The entire room felt lagged, as though time itself had grown heavy within those walls. When Elias glanced at the clock above the entrance, the hands were bent inward, curling toward each other, still ticking. Behind the counter sat a woman, pale and silent, her posture straight as the shelves bowed around her. She didn't look up when he entered. Her hands rested on an old ledger filled with names written in uneven ink. When Elias asked if the place was open, she simply nodded and said, "It always is, if you've come for the right memory." That night, back at the cottage, Elias couldn't recall how long he'd stayed there or what time he'd left. The clock on his wall showed 11:47 p.m., but when he checked his wristwatch, it marked 10:32, and the second hand moved backward. Outside, the fog pressed against the window like something breathing. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang 3 times, but the sound arrived in the wrong order. Elias Turner had once been a man of routine. For 30 years, he'd lectured on literature at a mid-sized college in Ontario, living by calendars and syllabi, by days that began and ended exactly as they should. But after Margaret's passing, time stopped meaning what it used to. Minutes lost their edges. Conversations blurred. Days became quiet repetitions of each other, an echo chamber of small silences. When the offer came to rent a cottage overlooking the sea in Newfoundland, he accepted without much thought. It felt less like a decision and more like a surrender. The village of Haversfield was the kind of place that resisted change. Its streets were cobbled with uneven stone, and the air always carried salt and a faint metallic taste from the harbor. People spoke in low voices, their eyes slightly downcast, as if guarding something between them. When Elias mentioned the library, most shrugged, pretending not to know what he meant. One shopkeeper muttered, "It's better left alone," then changed the subject. But the library called to him in a way he couldn't explain. Each morning, as the fog crept inland, he found his gaze drawn toward that boarded facade, the warped sign, the fractured windows, the door that seemed to open wider each day. It wasn't curiosity that pulled him, but a strange, uneasy recognition, like remembering a dream you've never had. He began to visit the place more often, sometimes just standing outside for minutes that stretched into hours. The air around the building always felt colder, charged with static. Inside, the smell of wet dust and wood rot was heavy enough to make him dizzy. Yet every time he left, he found his watch ticking a little slower, his reflection in the glass slightly delayed. It was as if the library had noticed him and was waiting for him to come back. The following morning, Elias returned to the library before sunrise. The mist had thickened overnight, rolling down from the cliffs and swallowing the town in its pale weight. He carried a thermos of coffee and a small notebook, intending, so he told himself, to make notes for a short story, something to pass the time. But as he reached the square, he saw the faint outline of the library's entrance already glowing with a thin, unnatural light. He hesitated. The air near the door vibrated faintly, as if the fog itself was humming. When he stepped inside, the sound vanished. The interior was colder than he remembered, and the shelves seemed even more distorted, bent inward, their spines curving like ribs closing over a chest. The air moved slowly, like water around his arms. Every sound, the creak of the floorboards, the whisper of paper, arrived a fraction late, echoing in strange sequence. The woman behind the counter was already there. She wore the same dark dress, her hair tied in a knot that didn't quite look modern. She didn't look up at first. When she did, her eyes had the dull calm of someone who had been waiting for a very long time. "You came back," she said. "I wasn't sure if I would," Elias answered. "They never are," she murmured, and gestured to the shelves. "You may borrow what was once yours." Elias frowned. "Books?" "Not exactly." She slid the ledger toward him, its pages filled with names and dates. The ink bled and shimmered faintly like it hadn't yet dried, though some entries were more than a century old. He traced his finger down the column until he found it. Turner, Elias J. Next to it, under date of return, the space was blank. He looked up, uneasy. "I've never—" The woman interrupted, her voice quiet but unyielding. "Then perhaps it's time you do." From beneath the counter, she placed a small glass vial onto the desk. Inside it, a thin strip of brown magnetic tape coiled like a dying insect. A faint ticking came from within, rhythmic but irregular. "Take it," she said. "But remember, time doesn't belong to you forever." Elias held the vial in his palm. It pulsed faintly, as if responding to his heartbeat. "What happens if I open it?" "You'll remember something," she replied. "Something that hasn't happened yet." He laughed softly, though it came out hollow. "You're serious?" She didn't answer. Outside, the fog pressed harder against the windows, distorting the morning light into long, uneven streaks. Elias stared at the vial again, half expecting it to dissolve in his hand. Instead, it grew colder. He slipped it into his coat pocket and turned to leave, though part of him felt that he'd already done this before. The walk back to his cottage was silent. The town seemed altered, objects slightly out of alignment, buildings leaning in directions they hadn't the day before. When he crossed the narrow bridge by the river, he noticed the current flowing backward, carrying dead leaves toward the sea. At home, he placed the vial on his kitchen table. It looked out of place beside the chipped mug and folded newspaper, like a relic of another world. He stared at it for hours. By late afternoon, fatigue overtook his hesitation. He set the tape against his ear, half mocking the thought, and for a moment, there was nothing. Then the ticking began again, closer, deeper, becoming a steady thrum beneath his skin. A voice followed, his own. "June 14th, it whispered, by the shore." He flinched, dropping the vial. It didn't break. The ticking continued from inside the glass, faster now. Elias pressed both hands to the table, his breath trembling. The words replayed in his mind. June 14th, by the shore. That date meant nothing to him. Not yet. That night, he dreamt of the sea. He saw himself standing on the rocks near the lighthouse, the tide rising far too quickly. The sky was white, featureless. From somewhere beyond the mist, a bell rang 3 times. Slow, deliberate, distorted. Then came the stillness, followed by the sound of something collapsing underwater. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat. His watch had stopped at 3:11 a.m. When he tried to wind it, the second hand bent slightly and refused to move. The house felt heavier, the walls closer. He went to the window. The fog hadn't lifted. Through it, faint lights flickered from the direction of the library. 3 pulses, evenly spaced, like a heartbeat from the dark. Elias sat at his desk until daylight returned, if it could be called that. His coffee tasted metallic. The radio refused to pick up any station, playing only static that swelled and retreated in perfect rhythm, with the ticking still echoing faintly from his pocket. By noon, he decided to return the vial. Whatever game the librarian was playing, he wanted no part in it. But when he reached the square, the building was gone. Only an empty lot remained, covered in wet grass and gravel. He stood there for a long time, unsure if he'd mistaken the street. The mist shifted, and for an instant, he thought he saw the outline of the library's roof shimmering faintly, as though viewed through warped glass. Then it vanished again. Elias turned back toward the cliffs, his reflection flickering across shop windows. Sometimes older, sometimes younger. Every few steps, the air stuttered, like a skipped frame in a film reel. He walked until the path met the sea, where the waves rolled inward unnaturally slow, folding over themselves in silence. From his pocket, the vial began to tick again, faint but insistent. He looked toward the horizon. The fog was clearing just enough to reveal the lighthouse, its beacon frozen mid-turn. Elias whispered to himself, almost pleading, "June 14th, by the shore." The ticking stopped, and for the briefest moment he swore he could see his own silhouette standing at the base of the lighthouse, motionless, watching him from another second in time. Elias whispered to himself, almost pleading, "June 14th, by the shore." The ticking stopped, and for the briefest moment he swore he could see his own silhouette standing at the base of the lighthouse, motionless, watching him from another second in time. He blinked, and the image dissolved into mist, but the unease lingered, spreading slowly through his chest like something too large to swallow. His breathing felt delayed, the sound of it arriving half a second late in his ears. He turned back toward the cottage, counting his steps. After the 12th, he realized the distant hum of the sea was repeating itself. Every 30 seconds, the same wave, the same crash, looping like a memory stuck on playback. Inside, the house seemed smaller. Shadows had shifted places. A chair now faced the wrong direction, and the lamp on his desk flickered without sound. Elias lit a candle, though he couldn't remember buying one. Its flame moved irregularly, fluttering forward instead of upward, stretching toward the window as if drawn to something outside. He went to close the curtains. Through the fogged glass, the lighthouse light blinked once, then twice in quick succession, like a signal meant for him alone. He pressed his hand to the window, his reflection staring back a fraction too late, lips still moving after he'd gone still. For the first time since Margaret's death, Elias felt not grief, but displacement, a quiet terror that time itself had misplaced him. He stepped away from the window, the candlelight trembling behind him. Somewhere outside, a clock began to ring. Not once, not twice, but endlessly. Morning arrived without sunlight. The fog had thickened into a dull white weight that erased the horizon, flattening everything into stillness. Elias woke to the sound of dripping water and the slow creak of the cottage walls, as if the building itself was breathing. His clock on the nightstand was stuck between seconds, the second hand trembling, refusing to move. He lay there for a long time, unsure if he had truly slept. The dream of Margaret still hovered in his mind, her face on the rocks, her hand reaching for him as the sea folded in reverse. When he finally sat up, the air felt colder than it should have been, like dawn had forgotten to warm the earth. He poured himself coffee, though it tasted faintly of salt. Outside, the fog was so dense that the village seemed reduced to silhouettes, rooftops, fence posts, and the bell tower. He noticed something off about it. The clock face on the tower no longer pointed to numbers. Only a single black line rotated without purpose, sweeping endlessly across a blank surface. He left the cottage, drawn by instinct more than thought. The streets had shifted overnight. Corners turned into dead ends. Buildings leaned at angles that weren't possible. Every sound was a little too slow. Footsteps didn't match their echoes. When he passed the bakery, the scent of bread reached him before the door opened, like the air had fallen out of sync. The library stood waiting at the end of the square. It was no longer boarded up. The windows gleamed, and the sign above the door had been repainted. Even the rusted hinges were gone. Elias stopped several meters away, realizing he could see faint movement inside, shadows crossing, papers fluttering, light breathing through dust. He told himself to go back. He almost did. But curiosity is a gravity of its own. He stepped forward, and the door opened before his hand reached it. Inside, everything was wrong. The shelves that had once sagged with age now stood tall and clean, arranged in perfect rows. The smell of rot was gone, replaced by the faint metallic tang of ozone. The silence was thicker, heavier. It wasn't emptiness, it was pressure. Behind the counter stood not the woman, but a man. He was tall, thin, wearing a dark suit that didn't seem to belong to any decade Elias could name. His expression was calm in a way that was almost rehearsed. "You're early," the man said. "I didn't plan to come," Elias answered. "That's what they all say." The man gestured toward a corridor that hadn't existed before. It extended deep into the building, lined with doors marked by brass numbers that flickered like candlelight. Some changed mid-glance, refusing to settle. From somewhere beyond the hallway came a slow rhythmic pulse. Neither heartbeat nor machinery, but something between the two. "What is this place?" Elias asked. "Storage," the man said, "for what shouldn't have lasted." They walked down the corridor together, though Elias wasn't sure when he started moving. Each door emitted a faint hum, and when one creaked open, he glimpsed flashes of scenes that didn't belong to him. A hospital bed, children running through autumn leaves, an explosion of light underwater. The man ignored them, his steps soundless. At the end of the corridor, they stopped at a door marked 14. The number blinked, became 6, then 3, then 14 again. "This one's yours," the man said. "I never borrowed anything." The man tilted his head. "You did. Time doesn't forget its lender." The door opened on its own. Inside, a single chair faced a projector screen. Beside it, magnetic tape spun slowly on a reel, whispering a faint, broken rhythm. The air shimmered faintly, as though submerged in heat or memory. "Sit," said the man. "It will be brief." Elias obeyed. Static filled the room. Then came a hum, deep and familiar, the sound of his own voice breathing. The projector flickered on, showing the coastline at dusk. He saw himself standing near the lighthouse, years younger, waves striking at his ankles. Margaret was there too, shouting something he couldn't hear. Then came the brightness again, the sea folding backward, light bending, the sound of glass breaking underwater. Elias ripped off the headphones, heart pounding. The screen went black. The reels stopped. The man was gone. He stumbled toward the door, but it had vanished. The room was shrinking. The walls rippled like liquid. Inside the distortion, he saw images bleeding through, people living, aging, dying, all within a single breath. He pressed his hands against the trembling surface. A voice came from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Return what you've taken." Elias backed away. His pocket was burning. He reached in and felt the vial pulsing violently against his palm. "I didn't take anything," the voice whispered back, almost tender. "You took your time." The air collapsed inward. The floor dissolved into white noise. Elias fell, not through space, but through an instant, his body folding into a moment that refused to end. When he opened his eyes, he was back outside. The fog had lifted. The square was ordinary again. The library stood sealed, windows dark, as if nothing had ever changed. He touched his coat pocket. The vial was gone. In its place, a small brass library token pressed cold against his skin. One side read, "Borrowed." The other, "Returned." He stared at it for a long time before realizing his watch was ticking again, but backward. That evening, he sat by the window, the horizon fading into pale blue. The lighthouse light turned, slower than before. His clock had stopped again, yet he could still hear ticking, from the walls, the floorboards, his own chest. He tried to sleep but couldn't. When he closed his eyes, he heard the projector clicking, replaying frames of memory that weren't his. He saw the librarian's hands, the man's eyes, the same corridor lined with doors, stretching farther now, longer each time he blinked. He woke just before dawn. The token lay on his chest, warm to the touch. The word "returned" had vanished. In its place, new letters had carved themselves into the metal. June 14th, Shoreline Room. Elias dropped it. The token hit the wooden floor with a sound that came twice. The first dull, the second delayed. The echo lasted too long. He didn't pick it up. Dawn arrived like a bruise, blue, hesitant, and sore to the eye. Elias Turner sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the brass token he'd dropped the night before. It lay several inches away from where he remembered it falling, as though the floorboards had quietly shifted overnight. The new engraving, June 14th, Shoreline Room, seemed deeper now, carved into the metal by something that burned rather than etched. He dressed mechanically, moving as though through syrup. The air in the cottage felt thick, as if the fog outside had seeped through the walls and filled the room from within. When he checked his watch, it marked 7:18. The wall clock said 6:42. The stove clock, 8:03. None of them ticked in rhythm. He wrote the numbers on a scrap of paper, only to realize the pencil left no mark. The page stayed blank. Outside, the fog moved like slow breath. The village seemed rearranged again. Streets folding into one another, corners curving toward places that shouldn't exist. A single gull passed overhead, wings motionless, suspended in the air longer than physics allowed. The sound of its cry arrived late, half a minute behind. At the far end of the square, the library waited. Its shape shimmered through the mist, flickering between ruin and restoration. One moment it stood abandoned, with boarded windows and flaking paint. The next, it gleamed with clean glass and polished brass fixtures. The two versions overlapped. switching each time Elias blinked. He stepped closer, the ground beneath him feeling slightly elastic. The door appeared closed, then open, then both. He didn't knock. He simply walked forward, and time accepted the trespass. Inside, the scent of salt water was heavy. A low hum reverberated through the air, vibrating in his ribs like the memory of thunder. Shelves lined the walls again, their spines twitching as if alive, occasionally blurring out of existence for a heartbeat. A sign above the central arch read "Shoreline Room," the letters glistening wet as though written moments ago. Elias crossed the hall slowly. His reflection followed him on the marble floor, delayed by half a step. When he opened the door to the Shoreline Room, the sound of crashing waves surged through, impossibly close. The room was long and narrow, filled with antique tables and card drawers labeled with cryptic phrases. Low tide, bell, turn back, too late, white sky, 3 steps. The windows revealed not the town, but the ocean, gray, alive, pressing against the glass as if the room floated just above the waterline. He approached the drawers. His fingers traced one label that felt warmer than the rest. June 14th, 1147. He tried to open it. It refused. Then another hand covered his. Cold, smooth, deliberate. The librarian stood beside him. "You shouldn't be here alone," she said. Her voice was soft but flat, the way a memory might sound if it learned to speak. The drawer yielded with her touch. Inside was a small, thick card, its surface cloudy and depthless, like smoke trapped in paper. On the back, neat ink read, "Return before the hour splits." Elias turned the card in his palm. "Before the hour splits?" She nodded once. "When time divides, every choice continues. Only one remains seen." He stared into the cloudy surface. At first, it was blank. Then shapes formed. A shoreline, the lighthouse, and a figure on the rocks. Himself, standing motionless, waiting for something. The image pulsed faintly, almost breathing. He looked up. "Is this the future?" The librarian's expression didn't change. "It's one of them." He turned the card again, uneasy. "What happens if I keep it?" "Then you'll owe more than time." Her words echoed strangely. He realized her lips had stopped moving before she finished speaking. Her reflection in the glass windows lagged seconds behind, whispering the last word again. "Time, time." The air in the room bent. The window panes rippled like disturbed water. When Elias blinked, he stood not beside the librarian, but alone, on the rocks outside. Wind struck his face. The lighthouse loomed ahead. The sky above was white and depthless. He knew this place. It was the image from the card. June 14th, 1147. A faint ringing sounded across the water. The bell from the tower, but wrong. The second chime arrived before the first, the third after both. Elias turned. Someone stood near the shoreline. A man in a gray coat, same as his. The shape of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, identical. The man faced the sea, unmoving. Elias felt the strange, primal fear of meeting one's own echo. He stepped closer. The other Elias didn't move. Between them, the tide flowed in impossible rhythm, waves rising, stopping mid-air, then collapsing backward into the foam. Every few seconds, the world around him hesitated. Then he saw her. Margaret stood on a rock further ahead, her hair wet, her face pale in the gray light. But there were two of her, one closer, younger, one farther, older. Both reached toward him, and though neither spoke, he heard her voice in his mind. "Don't let it break again." Elias stumbled forward. The closer Margaret smiled faintly. The farther one shook her head, tears bright in her eyes. He froze. The air trembled, and a vibration ran through his bones like a string pulled too tight. Between one heartbeat and the next, the hour split. It was not a sound, but a rupture. The entire world shuddering into two thin layers that refused to align. The sky flickered between shades of blue and gray. The waves rolled in two directions at once. His body felt doubled, pulled by separate gravities. The younger Margaret extended her hand. "Come forward." Her voice echoed inside him. The older Margaret whispered, "You're not meant to stay." He saw movement to his right, the other Elias finally turning, his expression a mirror of horror and wonder. They locked eyes, each knowing they were both real and not. The other Elias mouthed something Elias couldn't hear. A warning, a plea. The wind shifted. The two Margarets flickered, overlapping for a second, then separating further apart. Two paths, Elias muttered. Same beginning. The librarian's voice drifted faintly through the roar of the sea. Only one will remember. Elias chose. He stepped toward the older Margaret. Something deep in him believed grief was the truer compass. The moment his hand reached hers, the other versions collapsed. Sea, sky, and reflection folding into a single colorless instant. A rush of cold pierced him. For a moment he saw the younger Margaret vanish with a smile that was almost forgiveness. Then silence. He was kneeling on the rocks, soaked and trembling, holding the hand of the woman who was both real and impossible. "You came back," she said softly. Her voice was the sound of an old record slowing down. "You borrowed too much." He nodded, unable to speak. She looked at him with an expression that wasn't pity, but memory. "Give it back," she whispered, "before the rest of you notices." Elias reached into his coat and found the brass token, the borrowed one the librarian had given him. It glowed faintly in the fog. "If I do," he asked, "will this moment disappear?" "It already has," she said. "You're only catching up." She smiled once, fading as the fog drew tighter around them. The token in his palm turned cold. He closed his hand around it, and light bled through his fingers. When he opened his eyes, he stood back inside the shoreline room. The drawer was open again. The card lay inside, now blank. The librarian watched from across the room, her expression unreadable. "You crossed," she said quietly. "Did I?" She shrugged. "The hour still hasn't decided." Elias looked down. The brass token had changed once more. One side still read borrowed. The other now said due. The time engraved below it, June 14th, 11:47. He slipped it into his pocket. The air around him pulsed once, steady and low, like the last tick of a broken clock, and then the room began to fade. When Elias opened his eyes again, the world seemed cleaner, too clean, as though someone had wiped the edges of reality and forgotten to stop. The shoreline room was gone. In its place stood the library's main hall, restored to its earliest condition. Walls pale blue, brass lamps glowing, shelves perfectly aligned. Not a trace of dust, not a single sound out of place. He stood alone, water dripping from his sleeves. The floor beneath him was dry. The brass token weighed heavily in his pocket, as though the metal itself had grown denser. It was warm, but its warmth felt artificial, as if borrowed from something else. He tried the front door. It didn't open. No lock, no handle, just smooth wood where both had once been. He turned back toward the shelves. Thousands of books lined the walls, though he couldn't remember them being there before. Their spines bore no titles, only stamped years. Some were ancient, others yet to come. He reached for one. The book was heavier than it should have been. When he opened it, no text greeted him. Just rows of faint indentations where words might once have been pressed and then retracted. He tilted it toward the light, and the shadows of vanished letters began to move, rearranging themselves into fragments. June 14th. Return before the split. Margaret Turner. Record incomplete. He slammed the book shut. The lamps flickered in sympathy, their light pulsing in time with his heartbeat. Somewhere above, the faint sound of something shifting. A soft rhythmic creak like a rope under tension. He called out, "Is anyone here?" No answer. Only the quiet breathing hum of the place adjusting itself. He started walking. The shelves seemed to rotate around him, rearranging in slow motion. Corridors changed direction, narrowing, then widening. Twice he passed the same reading table, though he was sure he had walked straight. Every few steps, the brass token in his pocket vibrated faintly, as though detecting invisible thresholds. At last, he reached a staircase that spiraled upward into shadow. On the first step, a new sign had been nailed crookedly into the wood. "Returns," above. Elias hesitated. He knew what it meant, though he didn't want to. Still, he climbed. Each step echoed like a second delayed heartbeat. Halfway up, the air grew colder. The scent of the sea returned, not through the windows, but from within the walls. The wallpaper shimmered faintly, turning translucent for a moment, revealing images behind it. Frozen snapshots of different lives. A child laughing near a piano. A man reading by candlelight. A woman staring at the ocean. Every scene ended with the same moment. A clock, half melted, its hands pointing nowhere. He reached the landing. There was a single door, painted white. The doorknob was missing, replaced by a slot that perfectly matched the size of his brass token. He slid it in. The door clicked. Inside, the room was vast and circular. Books covered the walls up to the domed ceiling, but none had spines or covers, only blank paper fluttering slightly, as if stirred by invisible hands. In the center stood the librarian. The woman's posture was still and dignified, her face softly lit by the glow of a single hanging bulb. "You're late," she said. Elias swallowed. "You said I had 1 hour. An hour has many interpretations." He stepped forward. "What is this place now?" "The return desk," she said simply, "where borrowed time is collected." He felt his pulse rise. Collected how? However it was spent. She gestured toward a tall, narrow mirror on the far wall. Its surface rippled like liquid mercury. Within it, Elias saw his reflection, but flickering between versions of himself. Younger, older, drowned, alive. Each blink brought a new face, a new age, a new consequence. "I don't understand," he said. "You will," she replied, her voice calm but sad. "Memory is not the record of what happened. It's what time allows you to keep." The mirror pulsed. The reflection moved when he didn't. Elias reached for it. His reflection reached back, but not in sync. It moved a fraction before he did, anticipating him. Then it smiled. He froze. He had not smiled. The reflection's mouth opened, whispering through the glass. June 14th, 11:47. The clock sound returned, steady now, closer. Elias turned toward the shelves. Books began to fall one by one, pages tearing themselves free. Each page that hit the floor disintegrated into ash. "Stop it," he shouted. The librarian watched without blinking. "You asked for continuity. Continuity requires erasure." The pages circled him now, lifting into the air, spinning in slow spirals. On each, faint words appeared, the fragments of his life. Lectures, walks, dinners, laughter. Then they began to fade, replaced by new entries, things he had never done but could remember doing. Return to the shore. Follow the bell. Don't forget. He staggered backward. "You're rewriting me." "Not rewriting," she said softly. "Rebalancing." He reached into his pocket. The token was gone. In its place, something sharp cut his fingers, a splinter of glass warm to the touch. He looked down. It was the minute hand of a clock, bent in the middle, still ticking faintly. Elias felt his knees weaken. "Please, I don't want to forget her." The librarian's eyes softened. "You won't. Forgetting and ending are not the same." The mirror brightened. His reflection now stood in a different room, a cottage by the cliffs. Margaret sat beside him, alive, reading, her hair streaked with gray, her laugh soft and easy. They looked older, content, a version of peace he'd never lived. "That's not real," he whispered. "It could have been," she answered, "if time hadn't bent." Tears welled in his eyes. The reflection looked up, meeting his gaze. The other Elias smiled, the real tender smile he hadn't given in years. "Thank you," the reflection mouthed, and then the image cracked. The sound split the air. Light exploded outward. The librarian shielded her face, her form flickering. Elias stumbled as the mirror shattered into dust that glowed like embers. From within that dust, voices echoed, his, Margaret's, the man in the suit, all speaking at once, looping the same phrase in broken sequence. Borrowed, returned, borrowed, returned. The air grew heavy, pulling downward. Elias felt himself sinking into the floor, his feet lost in the turning grain of the wood. He fought to breathe. "Tell me what happens if I disappear." The librarian's voice reached him faintly. "Then the memory survives without you. But you become its echo." The world bent. The ceiling lowered. The shelves leaned, and all sound stretched thin like melting wax. He felt the minute hand in his grip stop ticking. The moment it did, the pressure broke. He fell. When he opened his eyes, he was lying on the floor of his cottage. The candle on his table burned low, its flame steady. The air was still. No fog outside, just calm gray morning. His watch rested beside him. It worked again. The time, 11:47. For a moment, everything was ordinary. Then he noticed a faint indentation in the wall across from him, a rectangular shape the size of a door that had never been there before. He stood slowly, heart pounding. On the desk, the brass token lay beside the clock. Only one word remained: "Do." He turned it over. The other side was blank. Elias looked toward the new outline in the wall. From behind it came a single muted sound, paper turning, slow and deliberate, and then a voice. "Next borrower." The outline in the cottage wall did not widen or knock. It simply breathed. An exhale pressed beneath paint, a rectangle of room temperature night. On the desk, the brass token waited with its stubborn word, "Do." Elias turned it with his thumb. No second message revealed itself. No permission. Just the quiet insistence of a bill that was also a doorway. He stood very still, listening for the library's hum. There was only the kettle settling after heat and the gulls testing the air. Ordinary sounds, respectful and small. He slipped on his coat, took the token between forefinger and thumb, and pressed it to the soft seam in the wall. The cottage inhaled. Plaster became hinge. Darkness unstacked into a narrow corridor paneled in old wood. It smelled of paper and salt. Drawers lined both sides, each labeled in careful faded hand. First laugh, the last word, left unsaid, kept too long. The corridor ended in a mild glow. Each step he took folded another behind him, as if the hall were made of moments arranged to be walked once. The room beyond was low and circular, handsomely plain, a patient heart inside a body of stacks. Cabinets stood waist-high beneath a domed ceiling. The librarian sat under a green-shaded lamp, posture tidy, face that of someone who had outlived and remembered everything worth keeping. The man in the black suit occupied the shadow to her left, neither imposing nor ignorable. "You're on time," the librarian said, which could have been kindness or arithmetic. "I waited to see if it would close," Elias answered. "It doesn't," the man said. "It corrects." Elias set the token on the desk. "Do," he said, as if reading it aloud might reduce the balance. The librarian nodded. "And payable. To whom? To what?" She opened a shallow drawer labeled custodianship and drew out a thin brass plate, blank and bright, the size of a door name. "Every hour we mend requires a keeper. We rotate the watch so no one grows stiff from it." Elias felt a tired smile try to happen. "I've been a keeper most of my life. Of syllabi," the man said evenly. "Of endings. This is nearer to shelving." "What if I refuse?" Elias asked. The librarian folded her hands. "Then the hour finds another body to live in until it balances. It will pick someone you've equipped to hold it, because hours are cruel in a fair way." He did not say Margaret's name. He saw the shoreline room reflected in the lamp glass, the card's milky window, the rock where one version of her stepped closer while another stepped away. The ache gathered behind his ribs without protest. What happens if I accept? The hour rests and stays where it belongs, the librarian said. You keep it upright. When the bell corrects, you go home. A pause, soft as tissue. Home is the sequence that can carry you. The man in the suit moved closer. His gloves were still on. There is a cost, he said. There always is. Placement, the man said. Chronology is a shelf we must rearrange. You'll keep the feeling. You may lose the order in which things hurt. Elias let the sentence settle. It rang true the way a clear note rings in old wood. He thought of the mirror that had offered him an unlived middle, Margaret reading in afternoon light, their quiet conversation braided with steam from mugs. He had believed it, and then watched it crack. The image had not been cruel. It had been possible. I'd rather keep watch than be chased, he said, and felt a steadiness answer him from his feet upward. The librarian slid a slim metal stylus across the desk with the brass plate. Then give the hour a name, she said. Names are the spine of order. He etched carefully, neat as a man signing a book he admires. Elias Turner, Shoreline, June 14th, 1147. The letters brightened as if warmed from below. When he lifted the stylus, the plate no longer looked blank. It looked settled. Your door will know you now, the librarian said. A second doorway had appeared on the far wall, unpainted wood with a small bracket where the plate belonged. Elias crossed the room, set his name into place, and felt the tiniest sigh in his teeth as the metal seated itself. The knob turned. Beyond it, the cottage, calm as handwriting. The rug a year off, the table an inch wrong, imperfections that proved the room was working. "How long?" he asked, not turning back yet. "Until the bell corrects," the librarian said. "3 notes. The third is the mercy." He stepped through. The air in the cottage had the decency of a modest day. Kettle cool, window bright, the shore moving like breath beyond the glass. He left the door ajar. It did not swing shut. He brewed tea and did not watch the clock, and because he did not, he heard it. The house, the street, the small and meaningful ticks of a world uninterested in drama. He sat with a notebook. Not confession, not argument. He wrote nouns: fog, rope, bell, shore, hand. He wrote verbs: held, returned, kept, corrected. He did not write died. The word presented itself. He let it pass. He wrote loved instead, and let it stand without an object. The first bell arrived like a bright pin touched to cloth. Clean, exact. The second followed as if correcting the angle of light by a degree none of his clocks could measure. The third settled them, and the room answered with a small relief, the way a cupboard door answers when finally aligned. Elias stood. On the table, the token had vanished, leaving a slip of paper in its neat geometry. 4 words in a hand he recognized from lists on refrigerators and notes in coat pockets. You kept it upright. He pressed the paper once with the heel of his hand as if to test the world's tolerance for tenderness, then folded it and placed it in the book he had been using as a doorstop. The doorway behind him had narrowed. He stepped through before it learned to regret being generous, and returned to the circular room. The librarian was closing a ledger. The man had removed one glove. His hand looked human again. "It holds," the man said. "For now," the librarian added, which was the only way she seemed to prefer things. "What becomes of the hour?" Elias asked. "It sleeps in sequence," she said. "If someone calls it, it wakes cranky. Try not to call it." "And Margaret?" His voice stayed level. "She is no longer in our care," the librarian replied, "which is to say her place holds too." He nodded. Acceptance did not simplify feeling, but it stacked it properly. He looked at the drawers circling the room. Lessons Unlearned was among them, tidy label, narrow pull. He gestured. "May I borrow? Not to keep. To learn how to keep watch. If I need to again." The man's mouth tilted, a half-smile a library might allow when it thinks no one is looking. The librarian slid the drawer open and withdrew a single card. Its surface was not cloudy. It reflected. He saw 2 chairs facing the water and a thermos between them. No faces, only a grammar of nearness. 5 minutes, she said. He didn't touch it. He stood close and let his eyes adjust. The room changed temperature by a degree. His shoulders changed position by an inch. When he blinked, the image was still there, intact as a kind instruction. "Thank you," he said, and did not ask where the thanks would be shelved. He returned the card with both hands. The librarian replaced it. The drawer closed with quiet satisfaction. The man put his glove back on. "Am I finished?" Elias asked. "For this?" the librarian said. "The rest is ours." The corridor out was shorter now. The labels on the drawers felt less like temptation and more like inventory. At the seam in the cottage wall, the paint remembered itself, smoothing as he watched. He placed his palm where the hidden jam had been and felt only plaster, cool and indifferent. Outside, Haversfield conducted itself with the practical dignity of a place that has always done the same few things well. A truck rattled past with rope coiled in the bed. Someone argued gently about the price of fish. The lighthouse completed a turn with no theatrical pause. Elias walked to the square. The library's door stood open, not to invite exactly, but to insist on oxygen. Light pooled on the threshold. Behind the desk, the librarian looked up and, for the first time, did not search his face for which version he was. She nodded with him, not at him, a small equality. He did not go inside. Some records are complete without a signature. On the cliffs, the wind had chosen a direction and kept it. A woman stood a few paces away, not anyone he knew, scarf at odds with a breeze that wasn't arguing. They shared the view like a table. "Beautiful light," she said after a time. "It remembers how to fall," he answered, and heard how that sentence did not need a second. They stayed until the bell in the square rang 3 notes in order that made no promises beyond themselves. When the last tone thinned, Elias felt the oddest sensation, the absence of pursuit. He had not realized how long he'd been listening for footsteps behind him that belonged to hours. He returned to the cottage. The wall was whole. The watch on the table ticked in a voice that had stopped begging to be heard. He brewed tea again, because repetition is a kindness when it isn't a trap, and sat down to write nothing anyone else would read. He wrote her name once, not to summon or excuse, but to admit. He placed the folded slip with the 4 words beneath the watch, and did not check that it stayed. Dusk came like a decision. The lighthouse sent its slow arc over the water and across the glass, over and across, as if it had learned its lesson and had no interest in drama. Elias stood at the window and let the light touch him the way a hand touches a shoulder in a crowd. The pressure brief, directional, sufficient. He said a single word to the room that had resumed being a room and meant it as both report and thanks. Returned. Somewhere, whether in a book, a ledger, a drawer, or the grain of a table smoothed by elbows, a line closed neatly after his name. Not loudly, not forever, just properly. And in Haversfield, on a night that trusted its own order, that was more than enough. When morning arrived, it did so without ceremony. The fog had withdrawn into the sea, leaving the air still and clean. The lighthouse turned on schedule, and the tide rehearsed its endless script. Elias sat at the same table where he'd written her name the night before. The ink had dried neatly, no smudge, no blur, as if time itself had decided to respect the handwriting. He lifted the watch from the table and listened. It ticked evenly now, unbothered, as though unaware of all the hours that had once refused to behave. The brass casing caught the first sunlight, glowing faintly gold. For a moment, he thought he heard another rhythm beneath it, the echo of that quiet library pulse. But it was only his heart, steady and human. He placed the watch back down and opened the window. The sound of waves entered the room like a familiar visitor. Nothing extraordinary waited outside, just morning, doing its work. And for the first time in a very long while, Elias didn't feel the need to measure it. He understood now that some hours do not return to be counted. They return to be kept, not by clocks but by memory. Not to repeat, but to remind. The library would remain where it always had been, half in the present, half in the margin, watching, waiting, lending time only to those desperate enough to borrow it. And somewhere in its quiet halls, on a shelf labeled with neither title nor year, sat a single brass plate. Elias Turner, June 14th, 1147. Balanced, shelved, upright, exactly where it belonged. If you found yourself inside that library, would you borrow an hour to see someone you've lost? Or would you let time keep its secrets? Let me know what you'd return in the comments below. And if you'd like to keep wandering through stories where memory bends and time listens, subscribe and stay close to the light.